The third of the Imperial German battlecruisers, and the culmination of their first generation, SMS Seydlitz was an incremental improvement upon her immediate predecessors. In comparison to the preceding SMS Moltke, Seydlitz was only marginally faster and only marginally better armored. In specific terms, she was about a knot faster at 26.5 knots design speed, though she did get faster in her trials, and had about 12 inches of belt armor in comparison to 11 inches on the previous ships. The change in propulsion layout and increased armor, in addition to a different layout of set armor, would see her displace about 3,000 tons more than Moltke. This armor, though, had her protected about as well as the first generation dreadnoughts. In certain areas, at any rate. In terms of firepower, Seydlitz was nearly identical to the Moltke sisters. She carried 10 11-inch guns, 28 centimeters for those non-Americans in the audience, arranged in 5 twin turrets. These turrets were laid out in the same pattern as Moltke, with one in the bow, 2 super-firing aft, and 2 wing turrets mounted to allow cross-deck firing between them. Though this was admittedly rarely used, as it tended to shatter boats and damage the deck with blast effect. Her secondary armament, then, consisted of 12 5.9-inch, 15-centimeter, quick-firing guns and casement mounts. She carried a further dozen 88mm guns, also casement mounted, for anti-torpedo boat defense. Though 2 of these guns would be removed and replaced with guns of the same caliber, albeit in anti-aircraft mountings, during World War I. To round out her armament, in common with other ships of the period, she carried 4 submerged torpedo tubes. 1 in the bow, which will be important later on, 1 in the stern, and 1 on either side of the ship. In common with German design practice that anticipated close-in battles in the North Sea or Baltic, Seydlitz's main guns could only elevate, initially, to 13.5 degrees. This elevation would be increased to 16 degrees later in her service to compensate for the longer ranges the British preferred to fight at. It is worth noting, though, that Seydlitz would be the last German battlecruiser to carry her weapons in such a layout. The immediate successor class, Derflingers, carried theirs in a more conventional, all-super-firing on the center line sort of system. They also upped the caliber to 12 inches. Though, to be fair, early design studies for Seydlitz indicate that there was something of a desire to move to 12 inches with her, though this ended up going nowhere for cost and other reasons. In common with German practice for battlecruisers, Seydlitz would be a relatively slow, relatively lightly armed, but very heavily armored ship for a battlecruiser. A memo by one Captain Vollerthurn sums this up neatly in Seydlitz's design process. We have increasingly pursued the qualities of a fast battleship with the intention of making the authorized number of large ships, as far as possible, also capable of fighting in the line. That emphasis was in the initial memo, as it was the key factor distinguishing British and German practice. German battlecruisers were intended of being capable, indeed encouraged, to fight in the line of battle, as they plainly lacked the number of battleships to counter the Royal Navy. Vollerthun continues to note that the light armor of British battlecruisers was dangerous even at longer ranges, something that would admittedly prove rather prophetic, though not for the reasons he may have imagined. Regardless, Seydlitz was, over the arguments of Admiral Tirpitz himself, who was encouraging Germany to move towards faster British-style ships, designed to the same standard as her predecessors. a relatively fast and heavily armored ship with admittedly low-caliber guns for her standard. You can thank the Kaiser and the German High Command outside Tirpitz for that fact, as I'm sure Seydlitz also thanks them. Constructed as Große Kreuzer J, and I do apologize for my horrible German pronunciation, Seydlitz would launch in March 1912. My terrible butchering of German there is translated as large cruiser, which was, at the time, the German practice for designating their battlecruisers. The usual period of fitting out and such followed, leading her to commission into the High Seas Fleet in May of 1913. The crew she commissioned with was taken from the old armored cruiser SMS York that was moving into reserve at this point in time. This experienced crew, it is said, would weed out issues from new men put in from elsewhere, earning Seydlitz a reputation as a quote-unquote happy ship for her crew. Though, during her sea trials, she would be forced to do what many a ship had to do during the age of royalty, running around doing whatever they wanted. Play host to Kaiser Willy and the King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, during Kiel Week celebrations. This would somewhat delay her sea trials, further compounded by adventures such as a minor grounding. She would only finish these trials in August of 1913, and when she was properly integrated into the High Seas Fleet in June the next year, she took Moltke's place as the flagship of Admiral Hipper, and by extension the first scouting group. She would remain in this position, with a few interruptions by less fortunate ships, until late 1917. That period of her life would prove to be quite an adventurous one. As just one example, from the very start of the First World War, there is the Battle of Helgoland Bight in August 1914. What began as a skirmish between light forces developed into a skirmish between cruisers, developed into a flight from the British battlecruisers. This gradually escalating conflict did not escape the Germans' notice. However, at Helgoland Bight, their battlecruisers were limited by a low tide preventing them from clearing the Jade estuary. It was only when that tide went down, and the German cruisers had been pounded heavily, that the first scouting group was able to sortie. Seydlitz, on her end, was behind even this as her port engine was down for repair, and she could only steam at her starboard. By the time that was fixed and the German capital ships reached the battle, it was already over. The British battlecruisers had left, and Seydlitz was only able to escort the battered German light forces back to harbor. Due in part to repairs to a bent turbine blade, convenient, how it keeps being her engines messing with her, Seydlitz would not see any further combat until November, when the first scouting group, and some hangers-on, would bombard Yarmouth. This amounted to relatively little, on the British side. SMS York, the same ship that provided Seydlitz's original crew, would strike a German mine and sink on the return to port. Rather unlucky of her, recommissioned for the war, only to sink to a friendly mine not even a year into it. Remember, kids, mines are not your friend, no matter who is the one who laid them. The next combat for Seydlitz would be another bombardment of the British coast, intended to draw the Royal Navy out into ambush. This would become a recurring theme in her history. However, the British had by this point captured German codes thanks to a beached cruiser and the Russians, and so they were aware of the bombardment, if not the finer details. This led them to attempt to lay their own ambush in return, though Seydlitz would only be struck 3 times by coastal artillery, doing minimal damage and causing no casualties. The German ambush plan was called off due to a, as it turns out wisely, cautious admiral, and the British would miss their chance by some 30 miles due to faulty signaling. That is also a running theme, as I will cover in my first alternate history mini-scenario. Yet another bombardment mission, for much the same reasons, would lead to the Battle of Dogger Bank in late January 1915. With one of their battlecruisers, the first one, Von der Tann, out for repairs, the Germans had 3 battlecruisers available: Moltke, Derfflinger, and Seydlitz, along with the armored cruiser Blücher. This battle, the first time the two sides properly came into contact with one another, very nearly ended in disaster for the Germans. Blücher would be sunk, and Seydlitz very, very nearly so. During the course of this battle, she was hit twice by HMS Lion's 13.5-inch guns. The first shell did little damage save for starting some fires. The second shell hit the barbette of one of her rear turrets. The blast from this impact set off ready powder charges in a workroom. The fire and blast from this, spreading through open doors in the ammunition hoist system, would quickly burn out both turrets in a wave of fire that eyewitnesses claim went as high as a house. This damage would have, indeed should have, been the end of Seydlitz, as similar damage would end British battlecruisers at Jutland. However, due to quick thinking on the part of her crew and heroic bravery by one officer in particular, her magazines would be flooded and the damage contained. The officer in question would be burnt terribly by his actions, as the valves to flood the magazines were already red hot by the time he acted. The British thought Seydlitz has exploded, actually, because of that fire the size of a house, but she continued on. Fire from her and the newer Derfflinger would cripple Lion's engines in turn, allowing Seydlitz to escape in the general confusion of the battle, as the British pounded Blücher into a flaming wreck. Even so, the repairs to her rear turrets would take 3 months to complete. Coming out of these repairs, Seydlitz would participate in the inconclusive, and embarrassing for the Germans, battles in the Gulf of Riga. Though Seydlitz herself would only participate in the broadest terms, she would do little other than provide distant cover. Though she did somewhat embarrass herself by running aground on November 24th, 1915, and then promptly getting one of her propeller shafts caught in a defense net on December 4th. After that, she would see no major combat until April 24th, 1916. On yet another mission to bombard the British coast, poor Yarmouth again, Seydlitz would strike a mine. Unlike the unfortunate York, she would survive this damage and make it home in good order. It did put her in dock for another month and change to repair damage, though. A month that delayed the upcoming Battle of Jutland until she was repaired. This would turn out to be a very good thing, with the benefit of hindsight, at least for Seydlitz herself. When the raid that led to the Battle of Jutland began, Seydlitz was once more part of 1st Scouting Group, though no longer the flagship. Hipper had by this point moved his flag to the newer, and soon to be very ill-fated, Lutzow. Seydlitz, then, was simply another one of the battlecruisers. An unlucky one. Though sometimes unlucky stuff goes around into good luck, as we'll see in this battle. For during the early stages, she was hit twice by HMS Queen Mary. In an ironic and unfortunate mirror of Dogger Bank, the first shell did little enough damage. The second once more set her rear turret ablaze. Powder charges detonated and blew out the aft superfiring turret, killing most of that gun's crew. However, protective measures installed after Dogger Bank, for precisely this purpose, would keep the damage limited to just that turret. The other aft turret remained in operation, at least for the moment. In return, Seydlitz and Derflinger focused fire on Queen Mary. A similar hit upon the British battlecruiser would prove rather more catastrophic. This fire would set off a similar powder explosion, but as the British had never experienced the same situation as Seydlitz had, they lacked the same protections. With terrible ammo handling practices causing compounding issues, Queen Mary would explode in short order with the loss of most of her crew. Seydlitz would suffer again, though. British and German destroyers, skirmishing between the battle lines, had been firing off torpedoes left, right, and center. One of these would hit Seydlitz, and ironically, near enough to the same location as the mine earlier that year. She was able to remain in formation for the moment, but more trouble soon arrived. In the large form of 15-inch shell fire from the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships of 5th Battle Squadron. These shells pounded Seydlitz with a vengeance. Her port side wing turret was knocked out of action by a direct hit. Several of her secondary casements were taken out. A second shell penetrated the already wrecked aft superfiring turret. And yet another shell would take a rather large chunk out of the right-hand gun on the operational rear turret. You can, in fact, visit that gun as it was preserved after the battle, by the way. It's quite interesting to see it still there. Seydlitz, by this point, though, was down to 5 operational main guns. No pressure, surely. Right? With the range closing by the minute, Seydlitz would take no fewer than 6 more heavy caliber hits. These caused so much damage, in addition to the earlier damage, that she was very nearly in sinking condition. By the time Admiral Hipper pulled away, Seydlitz was in a position where someone probably could have sneezed on her and she would have sunk. Luckily, with the sun setting, she was able to slip away. Her crew would perform a minor miracle of damage control in this brief respite, and kept her afloat in something resembling combat-capable shape. A good thing, too, as Admiral Scheer ran the German battleships headlong into the Grand Fleet and was forced to turn back. Hipper put his battlecruisers between the two fleets to preserve the German battleships. This was done to give them the chance to escape. It did, however, expose Seydlitz and the other battlecruisers, all already damaged to some extent or another, to yet more murderous fire. Seydlitz would, at least, manage to score the only hit on a British battleship in this portion of the battle by hitting HMS Colossus. However, in the run away from the Grand Fleet, the battlecruisers would run into their British counterparts once more. Seydlitz would take yet more hits, her remaining aft gun knocked out of action, and her entire bridge obliterated by a particularly savage hit. Fortunately for her, the German pre-dreadnoughts of the 2nd Battle Squadron would intervene, much as the battlecruisers themselves had earlier in the night. With rather less fortunate results for the ships in question, though the sacrifices of those crews did allow the battlecruisers to make their escape. Seydlitz, by this point, was battered heavily and limping along. Her engines were, almost miraculously, the only part to take no serious damage. However, flooding around midnight would force her to slow her speed. Right in time for her to come into near contact with the HMS Agincourt, she of the very many guns. Fortunately for Seydlitz, in the dark, she was able to slip past and not face 14 12-inch guns at point-blank range. By the time she barely slipped over Horn's Reef early in the morning, Seydlitz was down so far by the bow that it was practically submerged. Only one of her torpedo rooms provided any buoyancy in the bow, and had 2 pump ships not arrived to provide assistance, she would undoubtedly have sunk in the Jade estuary. As it was, she barely made it into dock, before promptly sinking at her moorings. Luckily in shallow enough water that it hardly matters, but it still goes to show how much damage she had taken. It would not be inaccurate to call her the ship that would not die. After 5 lengthy months of repair work, Seydlitz would return to doing what she had been doing prior to Jutland. Inconclusive attempts to catch British capital ships and defeat them in detail. She would see no further major combat in the war before the Kiel Mutiny and the end of the war. Part of the German fleet interned at Scapa Flow. She would be sunk at her moorings once again, though this time very deliberately. The German admiral in charge ordered his entire fleet to scuttle itself, and Seydlitz was no different. She slipped beneath the waves on June 21st, 1919. This would not be her end, however. Sold for scrap in the 1920s, she would prove herself as hard to raise as she was to sink. The first attempt ended when she sank, again, and took most of the salvage gear with her. One final strike against the British? Who knows? Not learning their lesson, the salvagers refloated her again, only to promptly sink her again because the man who salvaged her was an egotist on vacation in Switzerland who wanted to be around with the cameras when she was raised. So she was refloated yet a 3rd time, a 4th time if you count Jutland, and the final time, and taken under tow while still upside down to be scrapped. So ended the ship that would not die, SMS Seydlitz.